And I asked them real simply, how many people have used AI to generate images before? And of the, I think, 17 students that were in the room, 3 raised their hand.
So, Tori, that tells me that there isn't that big a conversation even about how everything needs to change. Because I mean, my argument is always, if we understand that we're not content deliverers anymore, then what are we? And that we have to start from scratch to think, what is school for?
Hmm.
And so credentialing programs just still rolling out the same kind of philosophy and people walking into a system that we're trying to actually change, but we're still getting people through the door, teachers through the door who are not changing with it. And then, the university entrance, it brings on a whole other conversation of so university courses.
Mm.
If the entire industries have changed, then the university courses have to change. So the credentialing has to change. There are so many steps we have to go back
Yeah.
to even begin the conversation. When we're starting with the haven't used AI to make an image, how do we get to those bigger conversations?
Right, right. And the production designer in me wants to call it timeout and officially start the program because you have to lead into that. You can't fake that part. So morning, Colin. You're looking a little scruffy, a little outdoorsy.
It's been one of those days. Let's just leave it at that. It's been on back-to-back emergency calls pretty much most of the day. So
You have that. It's been an emergency call day. Look.
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, I think we're all pulling long days right now. It's exciting. Lots of good stuff. But I mean, this conversation's so exciting to me. And I think, to your point, Anna, it all sounds good to have the philosophy, right? It all sounds good to sit in the space of we can change, right? But the challenge is when you have systems that have been in place for a long time, right? There's layers and layers of just compliance and bureaucracy. And because we've done it this way for so long, what kind of threats does this new thinking put onto the system? You're looking at, and it makes sense. In many ways, we're at a time where education is being forced to think quicker than it's ever had to. And in a lot of ways, there's a lot of respect I carry for taking things, being cautious when it comes to children and especially education, right? You can't be as entrepreneur-like as you would in the business world because the consequences are real. They're children, they're adults learning skills. I think the challenge though is when the system became so risk averse, right? Where it moves at this snail pace. I don't care if you're at a university or you're in the TK through 12 environment. When you have so many layers to go through to be able to get an idea through the door, or you have somebody who's super innovative leading a class, but they're not getting the funding they need because it's outside of the norm. The process isn't the same as what it's always been. You're squashing the change that could actually allow for you to meet in the middle. And I think because the systems, whether you're in high school or you're in a university, have, I mean, hoops. I mean, we're jumping through hoops right now as an organization to get to yes. And I appreciate those layers of transparency and the accountability in the conversation. I think those are important. But as we're continuing to go through the labyrinth of these systems to be able to get to yes, I can imagine the frustration from a local professor or a local teacher who can't get the support they need. So they then become the island. They
Mm.
just do it their own way and have found a way to operate within the system, but then it's not celebrated in the way it should
And
be.
it doesn't take root. If you're an
Right.
island, there aren't very many passageways into infectibility. I don't know if that's even a word. Infectionable. I don't know. It's too early for my brain to think about new words. So I wanted to ask Colin, you've been in now like the official education space for a little bit now, and being in the business world and now having a pretty substantial root here in the education world and listen to us yammer on about stuff. Could you draw a comparison to the flexibility and changeability of the business institution versus the educational institution?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. If I draw on experience, let's just compare Australia, the UK, and the US in that from a business perspective to an educational perspective, because I think we can draw comparisons across those three countries because I've had experience in those three countries directly in education and business. I think one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing today, and what I've personally seen and others have seen, and I think Megan, to your point at the start, is that if you look at the educational system, it's rooted in a belief system which is hundreds of years old, and it was designed for an age essentially for the if you just look at the core of it as an industrial revolution, we needed people to be working in factories doing jobs to a certain level and have a mass understanding. And fundamentally, what is being taught in schools has changed a little bit over the time, but the fundamental structure hasn't. When you then compare that to, say, the business world over the last 30 years, 40 years has gone through huge structural change. So if we just look at organizational management and what people need and the different HR laws and everything else in between. So often the educational institutions, they're their own ecosystem, and what goes on in those ecosystems stays within those ecosystems, and it's completely separated. It's very similar to the military, and that's not right, wrong, or indifferent either. By the way, it's just the reality. One of the fundamental shifts that we've seen, though, in the last, say, 6 years, especially, and I think this is why a lot of educational institutions are coming under so much pressure to change quickly. And I think, Megan, to your point on this, is that I 100% agree with you. I think, dealing with young minds, making snap decisions where the consequences can be, lifelong lasting, I think is an issue. But also not making decisions as well is also just as bad. So if you look at the business world and the rest of the world and so many other industries are being forced to shift. And so we saw two fundamental shifts that we've never seen before in our lifetime, and I don't know whether we'll ever see them again. So the type of shift that we've seen are from when we had the world wars, but this is on a much, much bigger scale. First was COVID. So COVID, for the first time in recorded history, from an e-commerce point of view in business, we saw the human race asking different questions fundamentally when they were buying products, when they were doing everything in their life. And we hadn't seen that shift before. And then shortly followed on from that, we started to see this explosion of the new technology. It's not so new, but the new technology of the large language models that everyone is so used to today. And we've never had a mass adoption at government level like what we are seeing. We've had lots of different technologies, lots of different companies like Google, Microsoft, Apple, and all of the big ones that have come up, but they've never had partnerships that have gone on with the government at the same time. There's always been this anti-monopoly laws that have supported it up until a level. Whereas now what we are seeing is we've had then the human behavior change, we're then having government approval, mass adoption in AI to do with military, to do with medical, to do with education. But then you've got people that are in all of these institutions, all three of those, if you look at medical, you look at military, and you look at education, that are going, well, hang on a sec, we've operated a certain way for such a long period of time, so it's putting a whole lot of pressure. And then, so there's this top-down approach, which we're seeing not in the US, of course, in education, but we're seeing this around the world. You've got this top-down approach in education where they're saying, okay, well, you're going to be adopting AI and it needs to be done this way. I don't necessarily believe that's the right decision either. But business has always moved faster. Business has always been 15 to 20 years plus ahead of where education is at. The best way I can put this now is that it's a lot more. It's kind of like, I think I've mentioned this before, it's like waking up, going to sleep tonight, and it's the year 2000, and you waking up tomorrow, and it's 2026. And that's how far ahead business is. But that gap is growing exponentially. And this is where the tricky bit is. And this is why there's so many educational institutes struggling with this. Teachers, TAs, principals, policymakers, and everything else in between, because it's changing so fast. And, we're seeing years and years of growth now happening in days. So it's completely unprecedented. And so we've always had this gap. It's just been completely blown wide open. There are, and I'll just finish on this thought, there are universities and there are schools around the world that are starting to take advantage of this, mostly in the private sector. And we're starting to see a lot of new schools coming up, like micro schools, and they're looking at, and they're operating as if they're an entrepreneurial company, because a lot of the old skill sets that are being taught in schools just are no longer needed. So that's my.
And we're seeing trends, right, of businesses looking at hiring high school students that are exhibiting human intelligence skills. So if you can critically think, you're adaptable, you have grit. The companies are looking at hiring at a younger age to mold the minds into the like of the company. Where before, at least in our generation, it was you go to college, you get your degree, and I'm not even going to get you an interview in your field unless you carry these credentials. And it's very interesting. You've heard, Elon Musk talk about, not wanting to hire MBAs anymore because of the way they think. They lack creativity in one of his interviews, as he's spoken about that.
Yeah,
like,
to be fair, we haven't. For
Yeah.
15 odd years, and we haven't hired outside of our data scientists, everyone else on our team, if they had a degree, they very rarely got hired because we had to unlearn them to relearn them to the real world.
That's interesting.
So that's the interesting part for me is to Anna's point and to Lucy and Cam, I'd love to hear you from the younger generation here championing for your generation. I love it. She can come in from it. But for me, when you look at the point of secondary, when you're looking at colleges and universities, there's the goal of TK through 12 is for a long time has to allow them to be kind of global citizens, getting them exposed to a different the world. Obviously, there's a lot of debate here. I'm talking very much painting a paintbrush, but getting them literate so that they can go out and function, where the university for a long time was meant to be that specific honed in, ooh, this is what I'm passionate about. This is what I want to do. And this is the degree I'm going to carry so I can go then work in this field. And so that definition of, and the gap that you were speaking about, Colin, where whether you're in a TK through 12 environment or you're in secondary university institutions, whether public or private or state run, the businesses are screaming that this gap, these students are coming out being excellent students. They're really good at doing school.
Yeah, that's absolutely what it is. Anna, Lucy, you guys work internationally. Do Colin's comments resonate with your experience?
Very much so. And I was going to say that one of the things that Lucy and I see is this problem of equity. And it was one of the first things that was on our agenda to talk about when looking at access to quality education, and then quality education in reference to how AI impacts it. And, economy drives change. And we're talking about a public education system that's not driven like a startup. We don't drive for that change because we're not in it to make the money. So that's why it's so slow to change. But then the equity gap is growing as fast as Colin was talking about. We wake up tomorrow and we're light years ahead of where we were yesterday. That gap in equity and accessibility to a solid future, if you look at the World Economic Forum forecasts, Job for the Future, these organizations that are really talking about what young people are going to be facing, it's where it's public education that's most at risk. And we work with private schools in Mexico who are investing because they've got the money to keep up. But our heart is in helping the people who don't have that. But it's like you say, Megan, where do you start the conversation with something that is so hard to change? There are so many levels, so many layers to go through.
So I've been wrestling with what Meg's going to say, and I'm going to say, how do we start that conversation? Can I get a side of thinking with that? That's going to be my new line, right? So and I think that when you approach it at a level of, can I get a side of thinking with that? So when a student is completing an assignment with AI, can I get a side of thinking with that? And how about any type of assignment? I don't care what you're doing. That question, and as I'm looking at entry points for people that are a little bit risk averse, not a little bit, a lot of it, whether it's a superintendent who doesn't want to go so innovative that they're worried about their board and their community and losing their job, which is real, right? And then you have teachers who are just trying to make sure that the kids in their classroom are proficient. But if everybody started asking that question, can I get a side of thinking with that? I think then it doesn't matter if you're using AI or you're using traditional methods. It starts them, it switches the mind to the goal is not the output or what you were handed, but the goal is the actual messy middle of learning. And I think that in whether you're a university professor who is passionate about their field, when a student is turning in a beautifully crafted assignment, can I get a side of thinking with that? Show me your proof. Send me your prompt. I don't care if you use AI, send it to me. I want to see how you thought through this. Because if a student is, and then the other thing that I wrestle with in my brain is if a student is able to use AI and actually become a more efficient human and thinker, isn't that the goal? So when people were asking me, hey, Meg, can't a student just use ChatGPT for IXR? And can't they like have their phone open on the side and like write everything in IXR Nexus to be able to just game your system because everybody is kind of gaming it. And so what is that? And I said, well, actually, if a student uses AI, our system is built for trends over time. So one of two things is going to happen. They'll use AI and they'll run flat, right? Eventually, the students' assignments will continue to be repetitive and the same because they're using the AI consistently over time to, let's say, copy paste an assignment in there. And the beauty of our platform is we've designed for enforcing students to think, right? So you don't get rewarded for complacency in Nexus. You get rewarded for consistent change and depth and complexity over time. So let's say, for example, a student is using AI consistently in Nexus, and they are actually producing higher quality work as a result. And they're actually, we can see their thinking, we can see they're engaging with the concepts, they are becoming smarter humans. I would argue some people would say that that's cheating. And others, like me, would say that's the whole dang point.
Well, it's interesting. That very concept is
sorry.
almost like having a parent at home for a lot of kids. And I taught for a decade in an area where a ton of kids either didn't have parents who dropped out of high school, didn't care about education, or just weren't smart enough to do the work that their kids were doing. And this was the game changer. Now, I left before this became a real big deal. So I'm really interested to see how the teachers are dealing with it now. But the point that you bring up is almost the great equity tool, because now you have a voice that can act as the wise parent should you not have one. You know, give me the reason, talk to me about this, guide me through this, tell me what I need to do. And done in the right way. And I think that the answer over time is a real interesting integration from a mathematical perspective. You integrate over time to see the change. That's a real telling piece of information, and almost could very well be the one true AI detector.
And I don't think and I would even go back to say the point isn't AI detection, the point is human intelligence.
Yeah, because if they're
And I
not
think-
growing, then there's
Because I don't
I
want to
would
be
say
a
that-
detector, right?
Because the differentiating factor is if a student has enough metacognition to articulate their thinking process. So yes, use AI, yes, do the assignments, but everything that we've designed is designed with metacognition opportunities for a student to understand how they got there. So if they got there using AI, they have an understanding of how they used AI and why they used the AI and why that outcome has enriched their thinking. Metacognition should exist in all spaces in education, and it doesn't always. It should more than ever exist now because we know that the cognitive offloading, which is the great risk of AI, will cease to exist if you learn with deep understanding of metacognition. If you if you learn through understanding how you think, then you can say, I used AI this way for this reason, and this is the outcome, rather than just using it. It's understanding how and why you're using it. So I think the metacognition is the differentiating factor, that somebody going in to use Nexus, they're going to have that everywhere they go. It's difficult to get through it without that.
That's true for the adult as much as it is for the student, right? Whoever the learner is in that moment or whoever is growing. So when the adult can see how what they're doing has an effect on their students and on themselves, that solves accidentally, intentionally, by design, but in that whole process, it solves for the adult being disconnected, being overwhelmed, being burnt out, because then you're connected back to each one of your learners, to what you're doing, and then that excitement is just palpable throughout the whole experience. And I believe that one of the reasons that we are so risk adverse is because nobody really knows, it's changing so fast, as Colin was talking about earlier. And so schools, the systems that I see here in Mexico, even the higher education and ones that are privatized, are still following the institutional imperative. So I'm not going to be the first one, and they are definitely, I'm seeing maybe a course that has AI or some forward thinking, but imagine the student who's in an isolated situation where one class, I've got a teacher, as Tori was talking about, who is forward thinking, who is looking to do something differently, is incorporating AI and critical thinking. And then I have to go to another class that's very traditional. It's jarring and it's uncomfortable and it's terrible.
Retention is a huge issue in universities. So when the students, and I think it's also an issue in public education, we're seeing a lot of students attend alternative ed schools. We're seeing homeschool rise 30% year over year since COVID. People are looking for alternative because they want the education that they're in to make sense for the world that they live in. And so when parents, and one of the good consequences of COVID is that parents got a kind of a glimpse into the education system. And for such a long time, I go to this school because I live in this zip code. And so when parents were able to see inside education and say, wait a minute, I don't know if this is what I want to happen, and started to have a voice. To me, that's a good thing. We need our parents. I think that when parents and schools unite, kids benefit. Until the parents also drive the legislative body as well. There's a lot of power in that grassroots parents movement. And I think for many, many years, because the parents went to school and experienced school in a way, for them, because they're not maybe paying attention to the world because they're busy working or dealing with their kids. They're not sitting in these forums talking about philosophy or what's happening. They're just living life because that's where they're at. They're busy parents. And so they don't imagine why the institution needs to change the way it does, the way people who are sitting in this space does. There's a level of disconnect.
Sure.
And so what would be interesting to me is, what's interesting is now that parents are starting to become more involved, they're getting affected. They're getting laid off their job. So they're seeing people starting to lose jobs because of artificial intelligence. So they're starting to wake up. Since COVID, they feel more comfortable being an active voice in the educational institution, whether it's TK through 12 or it's university and college. And so what I would say is that these public institutions who rely so much on students sit butts in seats, right? So that's how you get paid, attendance. And so if, we have school of choice and alternative settings for parents to choose from that are innovative and creative and are able to give students what they need, again, here's what I fear. Those that can will afford these alternative options that are innovative and preparing them for the world. And those that cannot will continue to be on the snail's pace. And so what I really hope is that education starts asking, can I get a side of thinking with that? And how they interpret that into their daily life can meet them where they're at, but slowly beginning to not accept that children are thinking, because smart kids, I can't wait for the Tories and the Collins and the Lucys and the Annas and the Cams to jump into Nexus to break it, because they will. And
That's
the best
awesome.
part is this team's going to listen and get better as a result.
See, Cam, that's where we need Brev, because he's naturally gifted to that sort of thing.
Yeah. So to me, I'm really thinking about the university professor and the systems in universities have a lot of similarities to TK through 12, but are very unique in their makeup, and each university has its own culture. But looking at a professor who's served their career in a field that they're passionate about, most of them studying, doing research in the field, current research in the field, to me, the goal has to be thinking, deep thinking and learning. And what we used to do, what we have been doing for so many years, how we have measured learning for so many years doesn't work anymore. And
Yeah.
so making sure that through this process, whether you are in a university or you're in TK through 12, that we are looking at systems that improve student thinking. And this is Nexus sits in that middle space so beautifully. I love that we're not entering the AI space, which is super, super noisy, right? With a product that deals with efficiency, because there's a lot of great tools that already do that. Nexus deals with efficiency in a different way. It's making sure that when a child is learning or an adult is engaging in the learning process, that they are also thinking.
Yeah.
And it's it's going to be foreign for students. It's
Cam, I
going to be
got a
hard for
question
them.
for you.
Yep.
Now, she's relatively, I don't know, more than the rest of us, for sure. Out of K-12. Yeah, sorry, Lucy, I didn't mean to break the illusion there.
Yeah, I was like included at one point, but here I am outstay.
Yeah,
All right.
sorry. If we're all getting kicked out of that, you're getting kicked out of that too. So, if you were in, because she was out of college, high school, just shy of the AI thing. So I'm curious, given where AI is right now, how would it have affected your performance in high school and college? How do you think it would have either interrupted or enhanced, or how do you think the instructors back then would have handled it?
Um, it would have been a mess.
Okay, honest.
Yeah, I mean, right as I left college, they were starting to try and do like AI literacy classes and at an art school that did not go over well. Um, there's
Yeah, just as a bit of background, Cam went to probably the most, in my opinion, the most evolved form of university. It's part academics, part skill driven, so that you walk out of there with being able to do, which is a part of the problem I'm running into with university traffic. Because when they want something new, they want to do something. There's a lot of thinkers, there's a ton of researchers, very few people who can actually do anything. And I'll get on that point maybe later. But she went to a university that is product driven, and is something that AI could intentionally interrupt. So Otis Design School is one of the best design schools in the world, and I could see where AI would be a huge problem. So how do you suppose they would have tackled that?
um, good question. I'm like the thing is like where it depends on how it's used. Used for art, it should have been met with heavy resistance because you're solving a problem that doesn't need to be solved. Solving the creative thinking work for people isn't helpful. Solving the work for teaching people how to think is. The problem is that most AIs are doing the thinking part for you. And while we had, artistic classes where you had to you had to solve these problems yourself, we also had, literature classes, science classes. And I think it would have been most helpful in that regard. Because my education, we didn't do testing. None of that was a thing. Everything was project based. So it was all about here's your prompt, here's your problem, how are you solving that? And then a big part of my education was explaining how you get there, presenting how you get there, learning people skills to help other people explain how you get there. And I found that to be far more helpful than any testing was. And I think if it were used in that way, like similar to what Megan was saying, like if it was held in check where, hey, if you use this, you need to present how you use this. You need to be incredibly transparent about how you use this. Why did it serve you? What did it solve for you? Or did you just use it to do the thinking for you? And I think that's probably the only way that I could see it being integrated in a way that still feels respectful to the students.
Cam, I think what I hear you saying, and I think what I've seen from students, young students in middle school, all the way up to my advanced age, as Tori pointed out, that depending on
the white hair has been earned.
How we're using it, but I think students will use AI for anything that they don't care about.
Yeah.
So when Tori
That's an
said,
interesting point.
when you said that there were only 3 students that put their hands up to say that they generated an image, it's because I think from my limited experience with the kids, they don't see that that's useful. They reject that almost as a whole. Now, people my age, which we've already discussed, is
Hey, cat's out of the bag now. Sorry.
right. Oh, I can't hide it. Like I'll have to put up the filters. Well, people my age are using it to generate art, which can be very offensive to the younger generation because it's solving something that maybe isn't as important to me as it is to them. So I just need an image to go along with this text, and so I'll make something very quickly. But then that younger generation might just reject it. That's AI generated. I want nothing to do with it. But those same students are very comfortable using an LLM to create the text, especially if it's something that either to get them from point A to point B or to do the entire thing if they don't care about it.
You just
Yeah.
gave
The
me
care
the effort
part, I think, is really interesting.
Yeah.
That is and you can manipulate people to care about stuff they previously haven't cared about. I mean, Colin can tell you all about how to manipulate environments and neurochemical responses to suddenly have people care about things
Wake up the curiosity.
5 minutes ago they didn't care about.
Sure. Get me involved emotionally somehow or another, and all of a sudden I care and I will die on that mountain about it. So, but what you all talked about before really reminds me a lot of professional sports, right? Before it was always the college graduates, then it was and they're grabbing high school students out the same way that we're seeing now. If we see proactivity, if we see these 6 power skills being utilized, it almost doesn't matter how old you are. You can be 16 or you can be 60. It's not about, it's about something more than just the end result. It's how you got there, and are you able to pivot? Are you able to explore? Are you able to use those skills to accomplish something that maybe has not even been considered before? And it's exciting.
Well, because it's hard to measure what we're measuring, right?
Sure.
There's a lot of science about
Yeah.
learning behavior, right? So we're measuring what good teachers have done consistently throughout their career. They've noticed trends over time with a student. But the challenge is when the system has a structure of 150 to 180 students per class, how is a teacher going to catch every student? And they're not. They're not even the best teacher on the planet can't and cannot catch every learning moment for a student. So when you use the power of AI and the power of immersion, right? Being able to look at students' learning behaviors. This is not psychological profiling or who they are as a human. It's how they interact with their learning. How are they engaging in the learning process? And then you add immersion. Then you're saying, we had a conversation, Colin and I, yesterday with a group of people that were talking about, the resistance for young children in high school to actually, they're so used to talking through Snapchat that they aren't applying for internships over the summer because they're scared about the interview process. And so, how amazing we have our first interview experience where a student can go in by themselves in a non-threatening environment and begin to practice that skill of interviewing with the hope of transferability, that they'll gain enough confidence because the neurons don't realize that VR isn't real life. And so they can practice that skill and then be able to go out and get your job. And I think those are, it's going to be interesting. This conversation is so robust and the solution is not simple. And when you're looking at transparency, which I truly believe with public dollars as well, it's really, how are institutions going to be held accountable to something like this? And I think when you have companies like ours who are looking at measuring the human capacities and looking at measuring skills that are necessary for the future life, I hope this team is at the table. So as the powers that be at the legislative bodies decide what the future of assessment should look like, they need to get people who have been in this world, who are experiencing from Tori, the university level, from Anna and Lucy and Colin from a global perspective, from a business perspective, from deep public education perspective. We can no longer we're doing the same thing every year. We're taking these CASP assessments across the country and we're seeing abysmal results. Yet we have a risk-averse culture that won't change. We know it. And here we have AI that's disrupting the world. So for the first time, that pressure, whether you're university or TK through 12, We have to look in the mirror. And I think legislative bodies, you're seeing, because countries that Colin had spoken about are starting to mandate from the top down, we're going to get a lot of results coming out of those countries. And the
I'm
United
wondering too
States.
how much of this has to come from the grassroots. You know, Colin, let me ask you, how do we invoke change, being the marketing guy, you know, put on the marketing hat, but now you're marketing to a system that has maybe the most institutional inertia of any institution maybe that has ever existed. What does the marketing campaign look like to try to get them to start scratching their head going, well, maybe we should change this?
Yeah, that's
So yeah, no pressure. And take a few seconds to think about your answer.
That's a very interesting question. For a long period of time, you know, working with companies, you know, whether we were teaching emotional intelligence courses or going in for change management, getting people to do necessarily what they didn't want to do, but getting them to do it and then wanting to do it was what we did. You know, the white paper on, you know, the 11 core neurochemicals for, you know, releasing dopamine and cortisol and oxytocin on demand based on, you know, different campaigns and marketing. So I think, putting all of that aside, I think there's two fundamental things. I think the gap that I have personally seen in my career, you know, I started my first business at 18, as you know, and I started really hiring in my early 20s. So, you know, around 24 years, I've been hiring people. And this gap between education and business, I've just seen get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think to Cam's point, you know, with what the students, and I think Lucy, actually, what you said, you know, different demographics are wanting to use AI for different things, and the way that maybe we would use it would be offensive to someone that is being a student. So for this to work, there's two things that education has to do that is never done before. Number one, it needs to look at what the real world actually needs and have communication with people outside of education. And secondly, it actually needs to have communication with the students, asking them what they want and need. Because the reality is right now, and education has done a very good job of setting millions of kids up for failure every year around the world. And that is now going into tens and tens of millions. It's really scary, the numbers and the early research that's starting to come out about this. And so I think for education for it to change specifically in the US, there has to be a fundamental change across the whole system and a fundamental philosophy change. And that's difficult when you're dealing with a system deeply rooted into hundreds of years of belief, which is institutionalized at every single level. You know, it's a ship, a huge liner that's trying to turn on a dime, and really it needs to be a kayak and be very nimble going down the rapids. And it's not going to happen.
Go ahead, Anna.
I think that what I've noticed, because working in learning and development in the corporate world, and then also working in K-12 and university education, what happens in the corporate world is it's top-down driven change, and then it's the grassroots people are kind of just being pulled along. Whereas in education, we are working with teachers who are desperate to change, who have lots of ideas, are full of enthusiasm, but are not able to carry it through because the top down isn't there. So it's kind of the inverse. But there are teachers who are every day facing, oh, what I've always been doing is not working anymore. Let me try something today and something else tomorrow and something else, and coming up with amazing things. Obviously, if they are accompanied in that thinking, then it's even more powerful. But I think that there is no marketing needed. Teachers know that things have to change. They're the ones having to face it every single day. They are the ones who can drive the change. So I do love this bottom-up change starting, but if it's not accompanied by top-down, then it just
Anna,
gets
maybe
lost.
this is more a question about protection rather than you know, having an external sense of direction. Maybe it's about protection. I mean, when we have, this is a movement where the teachers, and I am 100% agree with you. The reason this entire institution hasn't imploded on itself are because of those teachers
Yeah,
who are
100%
like,
going to say that.
smile and wave at the admin, smile and wave at the state, smile and okay, hi. Here's standards. And then they're like,
Here's your
okay, shut the door.
checklist. Yeah.
Here's what we're really doing. And so they take what they know works and they take and because they are the kayak, they can do the rapids, like Colin was saying. So I think that exists. How do we get protection for those people?
I think it will happen when it hurts. So unfortunately, sometimes systems like this don't really make the change necessary until the pain is so great. What we're seeing across educational systems is declining enrollment. We talked about that earlier. And
Yeah,
so when
that's
declining
sad.
enrollment
Yeah.
becomes such an issue because people are choosing alternative settings, this is where you have innovative charter schools. I led one. I was a kayak. I was able to do things in a school that most people couldn't do while living in the confines of the traditional system.
More like a pontoon boat than a kayak.
Yeah, it's a little more aggressive than a kayak.
There's a few more people on there.
So what I would say is you're going to see alternative schools leading the way. There's a lot of model schools out there that are doing this work and doing it well. There are teachers, like we talked about, that need to be protected, Tori. Unfortunately, in my experience and what my prediction is that until the system hurts, whether
You're probably right,
and
'cause
also
that's the
the
money
ego of
question.
the
Yeah.
American people, right? Once
Yeah.
the other countries that have done some of this top-down approach, where we're seeing results that are different than the United States, because we take a long time. We have individuals. I love the United States. I love that we have this ability to have a sort of local control, right? Knowing that each state has its own unique culture. States have a lot of authority over education. So every state has its own unique culture, and then every individual community also has its own unique culture. There's blessings and curses to that. But ideally in the United States, because we don't have the powers that be that can push down to every single state, each state, number one, is its own unique individual study on how AI is being implemented. But the countries, as Colin was talking about, that are adopting this from the federal level and it's being implemented all the way down to the elementary school level are going to be telling us stories. And I think if I know anything about the United States, we don't like to be second fiddle, but for some reason in education, we've never minded. We're like 42nd or something. And so to me, I'm appealing to this country's ability to be able to do great. We have the most innovative thinkers in this country, but guess what? They were innovative despite the school system. And to me, that is the challenge. So I think when the system begins to have continued declining enrollment, or the world is surpassing us because our structure is so independent that it doesn't lead to consistent positive change universally for the country, I think it's interesting times. I think the pain, unfortunately, will lead to growth. And I think when you have those moments of pain, and it reminds me of life,
Yeah.
the biggest times in my life where I've grown have come through pain. So I think as the systems keep getting this pressure, at some point there'll be a pain point or a breaking point. And it will happen probably uniquely for each state, maybe uniquely for each local education agency, but consistently those pain points are going to be felt. And we're going to see, I believe in creative people, and we're going to see some positive change happen. But it's not going to be this, like, what we would love is for it to be right the rug. Let's go. Let's put some new things in place. This team's ready to go and yip, yeah, yang to do it. It's not going to happen that way. There's too much dollars, too much policy, too much procedure, too much legislation, too much politics involved in education for it be to unwound so quickly.